Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar brought to you by the YNS Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA. I'm Dov Waxman, the director of the Nazarian Center and the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair of Israel Studies at UCLA. Our talk today is the third in a three-part series of talks given by the authors of three outstanding new books on the US-Israel relationship. The first of these talks was given by David Tal, the second by Walter Russell Mead. Both of these talks, like the one you're about to hear, are available on the Nazarian Center's website and on our YouTube channel. Our speaker today, like our previous speakers, has written a deeply researched and insightful history of America's decades-long alliance with Israel. But whereas the other authors emphasized enduring American support for Israel, Eric Alterman highlights the domestic debates, disagreements, and divisions that have accompanied US support for Israel since the outset. In his book, We Are Not One, The History of America's Fight Over Israel, he shows that arguments among Americans, and especially among American Jews, about Israel and Zionism are not new. In fact, they've long been a staple of American political culture and of American Jewish political culture. In the words of my colleague, David Myers, a distinguished professor of history at UCLA, We Are Not One offers a sweeping and definitive account of how America has thought and talked about Israel over the last 75 years. Eric Alterman applies his formidable talents to one of the trickiest of subjects, and the result is a book that strikes an impossible balance, massively knowledgeable, readable, fair-minded, and hard-headed. Both novice and expert will derive great benefit from this deeply engrossing book. I highly recommend it. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, Eric Alterman. He's a distinguished professor at Brooklyn College, the City University of New York. He has a PhD in history from Stanford University with a minor in Jewish studies. He's written 11 previous books, including the New York Times bestseller, What Liberal Media? The Truth About Bias in the News. An award-winning journalist and historian, he was for 25 years the media columnist for The Nation, in addition to having been a columnist at different times for The Forward, Moment, The Guardian, and The Daily Beast, as well as a contributor to The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Haaretz, and Le Monde Diplomatique. He currently writes the Altercation newsletter for the American Prospect. I'm delighted he's joining us today. I want to encourage you all to send in your questions during his presentation, and I will try to pose as many of them as I can during the subsequent Q&A. And now, without any further ado, let me turn over to Eric.
Thank you so much, Professor Waxman. And thank you for reading Professor Myers' quote, because I'm very proud of that. Sometimes you get quotes from your friends, but I don't know Professor Myers, and I have always respected him enormously. And it was a thrilling moment when I received that. So I'm very pleased to be part of this series. I've read the books by your previous speakers. As you can imagine, I have a few differences with them, particularly one of them, and I'll be happy to talk about that if people are interested in the question period. But that's not what I'm going to talk about in my own time. I guess I should begin by noting that we're approaching a crisis time between America and Israel, and particularly between American Jews and Israel. There's no getting away from that. I was actually at J Street over the weekend, and Tony Blinken came to speak, and he, if you read between the lines of his speech, he was preparing for this crisis, but he was laying down some markers that would make it appear that the United States wasn't looking for one and was perfectly open-minded until it arrives. And I thought that was actually a clever way to do it, although he's certainly received a lot of criticism for not being harder on the recently formed in-formation Israeli cabinet under Bibi Netanyahu. Some of you may have seen, I'm just going to read a little bit of Tom Friedman's reaction to the election results, which is almost a few weeks old already, but it didn't look as shocking then as it does today, given the way things are shaping up. But it's a good marker, since Tom Friedman is certainly the most influential commentator in a daily newspaper on America-Israel relations, and he wrote upon Netanyahu's election. As the previously unthinkable reality takes hold, a fundamental question will roil synagogues in America and across the globe. Do I support this Israel or do I not support it? It will haunt American students on college campuses. It will challenge Arab allies of Israel in the Abraham Accords. It will stress those American diplomats who have reflexively defended Israel as a Jewish democracy that shares America's values. It will send friends of Israel in Congress fleeing from any reporter, asking if America should continue sending billions of dollars in aid to such a religious extremist-inspired government. And then he says, you have seen this play before. You have not seen this play before because no Israeli leader has gone there before. Now, I am not shocked by this Israeli government. I've been thinking about this these issues for a very long time and looking primarily at the debate in the United States over Israel. That's the subtitle of my book, The History of America's Fight Over Israel. It's not about U.S.-Israel relations. I feel like there are enough books about that. Believe it or not, I really began this book 40 years ago when I was a senior in college. I spent my junior semester of my junior year at Tel Aviv University, 1980 or so, right after the first peace agreements were signed. I actually was on one of the very first buses from Tel Aviv to Cairo with my friends, and I went to a seminar, a Israeli-Egyptian jointly held seminar at Tel Aviv University. I imagine it may have been the only one ever held. And I came back to my home university, which was then Cornell University, and I was prepared to sort of train myself to be one of these Jewish intellectuals that used to write for Partisan Review and commentary in the 40s and 50s, 60s. And I discovered, I was just a kid. I was reading periodicals in the reading room there, the periodical reading room, and I discovered that this tradition that I had been planning to join had been hijacked by a group called neoconservatives, who were incredibly well funded. They were everywhere. They took over commentary. They took over the New Republic as far as foreign policy goes. They were on television. They had all these think tank appointments that sounded like academic chairs because rich people were paying for them. And I felt like my future had been hijacked because I was a liberal, like the guys in the past and the women in the past. So, so I decided to look into how this happened as for my senior honors thesis in history. And I examined the effect of the 1967 war on American Jewish intellectuals with the idea that they had all been dubs before the 67 war on Vietnam, and then a number of them became hawks. And I was trying to figure out if the 67 war and Israel's position in the world had changed that. And I had some interesting findings. But my point here is I'm such a nerd that I saved my note cards. I have these little note cards, a big stack of them from that research, and I used them in this book. And then I went to Stanford 10 years later, and I started a thesis on a similar topic, the effect of the creation of the State of Israel on American intellectuals and liberalism. And I did that for a year, and then I decided, with Jews, they write too damn much to do a thesis. The point of a dissertation is to show that you know absolutely everything about your topic. And I was never going to be able to know everything about this topic because it was just too much to know because Jews wrote and spoke too much. So I put that aside. And then 7 years ago, I signed finally to a contract to write this book. So I've been writing it steadily since then. And also in between those 40 years, I've been a columnist for lots of publications, primarily Nation, but many others. And I've written about it a lot. So it's really been simmering in my consciousness for 40-something years. And it's been very interesting, the transformations that have taken place during that period. I'll try to go through them. One reason I wrote this book is that I found during my period, particularly as a columnist, I spent 25 years as the Nation's media columnist, is that I've always found it almost impossible to talk about Israel with people. And it's gotten worse because one's position on Israel, if one is involved with the issue, is a matter of identity. It's not a matter of positions. You can disagree with people about how fast the climate is warming. You can disagree with people about the relationship between inflation and unemployment. You can even, I suppose the only thing close would be abortion. But if you disagree with someone about Israel, you're attacking their identity. And unless you share exactly the same assumptions about the conflict, then what ends up happening is people just get angry at each other. I've never, literally never in my life seen anyone change their position on the basis of a discussion about Israel. And part of the reason for that is that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians and Israel itself is so complicated and requires so many caveats to discuss honestly or fully that that you can always find a way to go around someone else's problem. I think if the phrase "whataboutism" hadn't been invented before this conflict, it certainly should have been for the conflict, because most conversations I've noticed, when someone makes a strong point, it just leads someone to go, "But what about whatever?" So I decided that the only way I could do justice to my strong feelings and my interest in the issue was to write a book. It's a bit over 500 pages, so I hope I did justice to the complications I wrote about. The book is called "We Are Not One," and the title has, I think, three primary meanings. One is, oddly enough, I feel like I need to explain that Israel and the United States are not one. And I feel like I need to explain this because if you look at the course of US-Israeli history, the United States has basically followed Israel and supported Israel in absolutely everything Israel has done. It hasn't done everything Israel has wanted it to do, but it has never really gotten in the way of anything Israel wanted, despite the fact that Israeli prime ministers are always infuriating American politicians and presidents, and they get mad at them, and sometimes they denounce them in public. They don't ever really stop them from doing anything they want to do. Second, the "we are not one" is American Israeli Jews. American and Israeli Jews are very different kinds of people. They have very different experiences. They grew up, they live very different lives. Today, they couldn't be politically more distinct. Israeli Jews are right-wing. They love Donald Trump. Israel is the only putatively democratic country in the world that prefers Trump to Obama or Biden. And they're getting more and more right-wing. Young Israelis are more right-wing than their parents and grandparents. Everything I've just said about Israeli Jews, the opposite is true of American Jews. They are, relatively speaking, left-wing, particularly compared to other non-people of color in the United States. They're the most left-wing group, and they're getting more and more left-wing. Young American Jews are more liberal than their parents and grandparents, and so the distinction is growing further. And this is perfectly reasonable because, again, they live very different sorts of lives than Israeli Jews. But the rhetoric that attempts to paper over this, I think, is destructive. And the third reason it's called "We Are Not One" is specifically with regard to just American Jews, who have enormous differences within them. It's very rare, I think, for a rabbi to talk about Israel in synagogue anymore, because you can't do it without causing half of the people in your shul to get furious, one way or another. So American Jews are deeply divided on this. The institutions that allegedly represent American Jews, at least in the media, do not represent the views of American Jews. If you look at who AIPAC was supporting in the 2022 election, they were supporting 109 insurrectionists, people who supported Donald Trump's attempt to overthrow our democracy. This is not the position of American Jews at all. Roughly 80% of American Jews reject that position. And a great many American Jews support the most progressive candidates in any Democratic primary. And of course, AIPAC spent a fortune going from primary to try and defeat those progressive candidates. So we're at this moment where the cliches of American Jewry that are, I think, trumpeted far too often in the media, that say that American Jews support Israel and that's why they matter politically, and so Israel is the way to reach them, are very much out of date. The fact is that only 4% of American Jews put Israel at the top of their political agenda, and that 4% is divided, 2 and 2. So it's a new world as far as this debate goes. I've written a book in part to help people catch up. Now, I'll try and go through the history in the time that I have so that we have plenty of time for questions. But it's going to be hard because, like I said, everything is complicated. But again, slightly simplistically, most American Jews were anti-Zionist up through the 1920s. The modern Zionist movement began in 1896 or 1897, and American Jewish leaders were almost unanimous in denouncing it. They were afraid that they would be perceived, if they supported the settlement of another country by Jews, that they would be perceived as disloyal to the United States. And they were also very unhappy about the very idea of Jewish peoplehood. They wanted their fellow Christian citizens of the United States to think of Judaism as strictly as a religion, just like Christianity was, and that a religion that they actually had a great deal in common with. And it was only beginning in the 1920s, when Louis Brandeis, the former Supreme Court justice at the time, became head of the Zionist organization, came up with the idea that Zionism made sense for other Jews who were threatened by their situation in other places in the world, but not in the United States. So the Zionist movement was about helping other Jews get to Palestine, but American Jews were cool with where they were. American Jews, Zion was the United States. Now, this position was held for a while in contention with the earlier position, but then in the 1940s, when people became aware of Hitler's mass murder of Jews because they were Jews, and also of the efforts to settle Palestine by the Zionists, they decided to embrace Zionism incredibly enthusiastically, actually. And you know, they were horrified and depressed and shamed by how little they could do to help European Jews, but they were thrilled by the future and the creation of not only the Israeli society, but this new Jew who was exciting and not like Jews of the past. He and she were both strong and self-confident and militarily capable, and they were farmers and workers, and it was great. Everybody, you know, the past was a shameful past, and the future was a heroic future. And so they embraced Zionism, and they embraced the creation of the state of Israel to an incredible degree. There probably wouldn't have been, Harry Truman probably would not have recognized the state of Israel 11 minutes after it was declared in May of 1948, had it not been for the intense pressure that he was under politically from Zionist movement. There were some towns in America that sent in more postcards and more letters to the president and to Congress than they had people in those towns. Of course, the politicians from Democratic strongholds were very strongly in favor of Israel. And even though, one thing I've always been curious about, we can talk about later, is that even though the State Department and the entire national security apparatus were against this, and they opposed the creation of the state of Israel, I still don't figure out what they could have thought was their alternative, because Britain was not going to stay and the United States was not going to send troops there. So there would have been nobody to keep order there. And this was the argument that actually the president's advisor, Clark Clifford, made at this famous meeting where Truman was deciding what to do. And Secretary of State Marshall was saying, don't do it. And Clifford was saying, well, number one, you got to do it because the UN needs to be supported. But number two, the Zionist government is the only working government there. And that was true. And that both of those things had a big effect on Truman's decision, I think. Now, weirdly, and by the way, the driving issue, I think, for the president himself was the refugees in Europe, the hundreds of thousands of refugees, maybe 250,000, who were living in camps that were not unlike the concentration camps they had been in during Nazi Germany. And if there had been a way to bring them into Palestine without creating a state of Israel, that would have been preferable to the United States and to many Jews, but there wasn't. And so you had to have a state of Israel. There was a group of intellectuals who were very famous, led by a rabbi named Judah Magnus, but including many respected Jews. It was supported in the United States by Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt. It was supported in Israel by Henrietta Zoll, and many names that were among the most famous names in the Yeshu, the Jewish community, that said there should be no state without agreement on the part of Arabs. But there were never going to be any agreement on the part of Arabs. There never has been. That's something we can talk about. One can blame them, as the famous UN Israeli representative Abba Eban said. They've never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. I think that's true on the one hand. On the other hand, they've also never been able to see the future, which is true of all of us. In any case, there was no peace. There was a peace camp in Israel that among the Jews that had very little support anywhere, except for, weirdly, in the United States State Department and the New York Times, which treated it as if it were an alternative government. But once the state was declared, that was that, and there was a state. And interestingly, and I don't think people are so aware of this, after the state was declared and Israel came into being, American Jews sort of went back to their lives as they had been before. They liked Israel. They probably, their kids collected money to plant trees there. They may have even marched in an Israel Day parade with their synagogues, but it wasn't first and foremost in their minds at all. This is hard to believe. The 1966 annual report of the American Jewish Committee did not mention Israel until page 35. Nathan Glazer wrote a very well-received book, I believe it was published in 1960, called American Judaism, that does not even mention Israel. There was a massive change. There was the movie Exodus and the book Exodus, and those are a big deal, and they're actually still a big deal. But this was this Disney version. You can call it a Disney version of Israel, or now we refer to it as the Exodus version of Israel, which was tremendously important and influential in the way people perceived Israel as this heroic country, and perceived the Arabs as not even human, beneath humanity. The movie even put Nazis in with the Arabs. But again, most countries in the world, the Jews kind of emptied out. I think France is the exception, besides the United States. The United States, not even 5% of American Jews chose to move to Israel. This has always been a wound in the Israeli psyche. They've always felt like the diaspora should just give it up and join them and live a fully Jewish life. And they've shown a great deal of contempt for American Jewish life, feeling it's sort of ridiculous and it's on its way to disappearing, either because of anti-Semitism or because of assimilation. But American Jews have never agreed with this. Neither have French Jews either. And so they went back to living their lives. And American Jewish life from 1948 to 1967 was really not that different from being a liberal. The idea was America was going to become a better place. It was going to become fairer. Civil rights were going to become real. Separation of church and state was important. Inequality was important. Social services were important. And Jews were going to lead the way. Jews were going to help out in a big way. That was what it meant to be a secular American Jew. I'm leaving out the Orthodox. All of this changed literally. I would say literally overnight, but I'm a stickler on the word literally. So I would say literally over 6 nights in 1967. To a degree that was entirely unpredictable, and it's still shocking if you look carefully at it. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the book. This is the only thing I'm going to read, so I apologize in advance. I don't like to read, but I did a good job in the book, so I'm going to read it. In a remarkably prescient article published in Commentary just weeks after the war. Here, let me put my iPad here so I can look at the camera more. Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, who was also a historian, noted that the crisis had united American Jews, quote, with deep commitments as they have never been united before, and it has evoked such commitments in many Jews who previously seemed untouched by them. A much admired scholar of Jewish history, as well as a congregational rabbi, Hertzberg could find, quote, no conventional Western theological terms with which to explain this. Rather, he found that, quote, most contemporary Jews experience these emotions without knowing how to define them, as Israel has become the very strong focus of worldwide Jewish emotional loyalty. Of these predictions of, quote, terror and dread, as Abraham Joshua Heschel put it, metamorphosed into exaltation among American Jews in the immediate aftermath of the war. And this is true. It's amazing that he caught it so quickly, but the examples of the fear that American Jews had right before the war of the Jews being driven into the sea in a, quote, often always attributed to General Nasser of Egypt, but probably never said by him, were fantastic. I mean, the degree of fear was fantastic. People felt like they were about to be forced to sit still for a second Holocaust, and they were horrified by this. And when the war came, the fact that it took place in 6 days, just like the Bible said God created the earth, it felt like a divine intervention. And all of a sudden, American Jewish life switched from being about liberalism and social services and citizenship in the United States to support for Israel, primarily, and remembrance of the Holocaust, which is, I see it as in some ways as a corollary for support for Israel. And the budgets of these organizations completely transformed themselves, as did their size. So groups that were basically involved in delivering meals and arguing in Supreme Court briefs on behalf of civil rights became all about Israel. And if you didn't support Israel, then you were left out of the team. This was true of American intellectuals too. Commentary magazine, believe it or not, had been pretty anti-Zionist before '67, and it flipped overnight, as did its corollary Dissent, the socialist version, which Woody Allen and Annie Hall says they're combining and forming dysentery. I'm going to read a little bit more. That's a joke. A little bit more, and then
okay. Media will play louder.
Oh, I must have pressed the button there. Sorry. The power of these emotions and the institutional changes they presaged would lead to a remarkably rapid remaking of American Jews' collective identity. It had long been difficult to explain just what non-Orthodox Jews believed that distinguished them from mainstream American Protestants, save for the fact that Jesus had been conceived in the usual fashion. The rituals of Jewish life remained vibrant in many families, but the theology was decidedly fuzzy. Most Jewish communal organizations pursued agendas indistinguishable from most liberal organizations. Jews had their own foods, their own country clubs, law firms, vacation spots, but the sermons of their rabbis sounded an awful lot like the typical college commencement address. To be a secular American Jew pre-1967 was to have faith that America was going to make itself better, fairer, more equal, more peaceful with the help of its Jews. Support for the Zionist cause in the past had been, quote, one among various alternatives of Jewish identity, the Jewish scholar and Rabbi Shaul Magid would write in 2009. Beginning in 1967, however, the Jewish discourse about Zionism became Jewish identity itself. Zionism defines Jewish legitimacy and is no longer part of the conversation. It defines the conversation. Magid quotes Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, leader of New York City's congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the nation's largest LGBT-oriented shul, observing, a Jew today can walk into almost any non-Orthodox synagogue in America and profess his or her atheism or lack of Jewish practice and be embraced and accepted. But if a Jew enters that same synagogue and professes to be anti or even non-Zionist, he or she will likely be shown the door. So as these organizations became transformed and Jewish identity became transformed, a lot of things changed as a result. AIPAC, for instance, had been a pretty small organization. It was originally worked directly for the Israelis, but there was some problems with following American laws, and there were some investigations that had to be quashed by the White House. And so it eventually became the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And originally it worked quietly to get legislation passed that would help out Israel without too much attention being paid to it. John Kennedy was the first president to actually sell arms to Israel. But after 67, well, actually before 67, it started to try and pay attention to the American press. After 67, it grew to the point where it could really create a groundswell of criticism of any position on Israel that diverted from what I'm calling the Exodus narrative. Now, this went on for a while. It created lots of problems for Nixon and Kissinger and terrible problems for Jimmy Carter. I go into great detail about this in the book. But things really came together. I'm jumping ahead now, much more than I would like to. Under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, when AIPAC decided, after it lost a battle over selling weaponry to Saudi Arabia with the Reagan administration, that it needed to become a grassroots organization with chapters all over America, even in places where there were no Jews. It joined together with the newly politicized Christian Zionist movement, which it was quite controversial because the Christian Zionists were supporting Israel because they were looking forward to the day that all Jews would go to hell in the rapture, and they would be raptured up to heaven. But nevertheless, was good for Israel, and Jewish leaders decided this was a pretty good bargain for the most part. And so they didn't mind that the inherent anti-Semitism of the theology, as well as consistent anti-Semitic statements made by its leaders, statements I think don't look so harmless today as anti-Semitism becomes a much bigger issue for all of us. And with the Reagan administration, its conservative orientation, the whole picture had changed. So Israel, which previously had been seen as a liberal, even socialist project, anti-imperialist, supported by the nation in the 1940s and the New Republic back in those days for different reasons, and the New Republic sorted later, supported by Marxists in the United States, it became a conservative cause, slowly, but immeasurably. Now, part of this was because Israel itself became much more conservative. It elected a conservative government in 1977. But the conservatives in both countries began moving towards each other. And liberals became increasingly disillusioned with Israel. This began with the 1982 invasion of Lebanon and the siege of Beirut. The media, which had been almost 100% celebratory of Israel before that, couldn't believe it. It was seeing much of the international media was located in Beirut, and the destruction of that city, the Paris of the East, was a great shock to their idea of Israel. The first Intifada, 1988, where it was young boys throwing rocks at soldiers, and the order came out from Yitzhak Rabin, the prime minister, to break their bones. This was another shock to the world, and to the liberal world in particular. The second thing that happened in that period was the emergence of Palestinian leadership that didn't look like Yasser Arafat. That looked like professors and doctors and lawyers in any Western country. There was a famous week-long broadcast by Ted Koppel from Nightline from Jerusalem that was reshown on PBS. I don't think this has ever happened any other time, where the Israelis and the Palestinians, separated by a wall, argued with one another. And the case for the Palestinians was made in a way that most Americans had never heard of before. And it really, you could really see a change taking place in that period. Now, 9/11, the Iraq invasion, you can see me jumping way ahead. These also had the effect of making Israel appear much more comfortable with an imperial America, with a strong America that used military power on its own behalf and implicitly on Israel's behalf. And the peace movement, which was a liberal movement, increasingly distasteful towards this. Meanwhile, Israel itself became much more conservative over time, leading to where we are today, where it's very comfortable with illiberal governments around the world. It's increasingly theocratic. The occupation, which was supposed to be temporary, looks like it's going to go on forever. And there's been a change. I'm sure many of the people watching this have experienced this in the way young people learn about Israel in college. Again, it's not if there's a David and Goliath in this conflict, those two roles have switched. The Palestinians are now David. It used to be that the Arabs were Goliath, but now it's the Palestinians that are David, and Israel is the Goliath. And the Republican Party, led by its Christian evangelical base and conservative right-wing Jewish funders, the most famous of whom is the late Sheldon Adelson, has defined itself entirely behind Israel, unquestionably, to the point where if only Bibi Netanyahu had been born in the United States, he could probably be the next Republican president. Whereas the Democratic Party, which had always been supportive of Israel, although to some degree divided on this point, not divided in fact, but divided in its heart, because its Zionism was often in conflict with its liberalism, and Israel was saying, you have to choose us. You can do liberal anything else, but not with regard to us. This is when left-wingers or pro-Palestinian people call PEP, progressive except for Palestine. Well, the change is happening very gradually, both among young American Jews and young Democrats, to the point now where the Democratic Party is about 50-50 as to whether or not you support Israel more than you support the Palestinians. But young Democrats are much more supportive of the Palestinians than they are of the Israelis, and this is moving at a relatively rapid pace. With regard to American Jews per se, I think this is happening differently. American Jews are still largely supportive of Israel, but that's in part because many American Jews who are not supportive of Israel have ceased being Jewish or in the process of ceasing to be Jewish. Conservative Jewry has lost about a third of its members in the past 15 years. Reform Jewry has lost about half that number, but that's masked by the fact that many conservatives have dropped into Reform Jewry. So young people, I mean, intermarriage is obviously a big factor here too, but young people are looking at Judaism as defined by mainstream Jewish organizations, which say it means supporting Israel, remembering the Holocaust, and fighting anti-Semitism, and saying this is not meaningful to me the way it was to my parents and grandparents, the way it was to me when I was a child growing up. So so we've reached a point where the discourse, which is what my book is about, it's really focuses on what a hero of mine, Jürgen Habermas, defines as the public sphere, is divorced from the actual political effects of the debate. So if you're just following what American policy is towards Israel, you'd say, well, 2021, Israel had this little war with Hamas. Israel had already agreed under Barack Obama, the allegedly anti-Israel Barack Obama, to give, the United States had agreed to give it $38 billion over a period of 10 years, something that is unprecedented in the history of diplomatic relations. It's committed to it. And then they decided, well, we better give them another billion because that's what it cost them to use the Iron Dome missile system that protected it from Hamas missiles during the war. So what was the vote? Well, there were 8 nay votes and 1 abstention against giving Israel this extra billion. The only abstention was AOC from New York. So even though the Democratic Party is 50-50 and there were lots of complaints and lots of noise and lots of attacks on the people making the complaints, it didn't end up mattering at all. Tell you a quick story that I read, maybe some of you read it, in Barack Obama's memoir. His aide, Deputy National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, came rushing into his office, very upset. And he said to the president, I just came back from this congressman's office. He's really upset about you trying to freeze Israeli settlements. And Obama said, wait, the dude is against Israeli settlements. And Rhodes said, yeah, but he's more against doing anything about Israeli settlements. And I say that this was Obama's problem at the beginning of his administration, and it was his position at the end of his administration. And that's because, number one, the system is so strongly defined in favor of Israel. AIPAC is that strong. The other organizations are that strong, and the Palestinians are that weak. And also, I have to say, sadly, that bad at politics. The final thing I want to say is I wrote this book as a historian, and I don't appear in the book really at all, even though I could, because I wanted to stay out of it. I wanted to be judged as if any sensible person had written this book and done the work I did. At the very end, though, I come in and I say, I mean, I'm not saying it explicitly, but this is what I'm getting at. I'm worried about the future of American Judaism for the reasons I implied earlier. I care deeply about its American Jews and its history, and I've been really involved in studying and thinking about Judaism now for 30 years. It's been the most interesting thing in my life that I can remember ever studying, even though I'm not religious. And I think, as I said, all of the effort that's gone into defending Israel and defending quote unquote Zionism from quote unquote anti-Zionism, I find these terms kind of ridiculous because Israel is not going anywhere. It is a country. It's like being anti-France or against France. You can criticize it. You can criticize its government, but the idea that it's going to go anywhere is just silly. I feel like that it's hollowed out what American Judaism has to offer non-Orthodox Jews. Orthodox Jews are a separate story. They are 100% behind Israel. They have the same views as Israelis, by and large. They like Trump and hate Obama. But the Jews that make up the 75% of American Jews that support Democrats and support Obama and Biden, they are increasingly disaffected. As I said, many are leaving. And young people look at it and say, well, Israel is not something I can support in good conscience, given the way it treats the Palestinians and how antithetical so much of it is to my own values. And the Holocaust was terrible, sure, but there have been a lot of terrible mass murders since then. I'm not sure that it moves me the way it moved my grandparents or my parents. People heard about it from their grandparents and parents. And yes, anti-Semitism is a bad thing. But I don't know how much it actually threatens the safety of American Jews. It's scary in its political implications today. This is something that's unclear at the moment, since it's kind of brand new. The effect, the intensity of it. I mean, it's only recently that Elon Musk has been inviting anti-Semites into Twitter, and Donald Trump has been having dinner with them. So we don't really know where it's going. But it's not like the idea of comparing it to Germany in the 1930s is ridiculous, as much as American Jewish organizations tend to take the position. So the replacement, the way I put it, the replacement of the rabbis by the machers has been really deleterious to American Jewry. Even if you think Israel has done everything right and everything it's done is entirely defensible and wonderful, it's still a vicarious relationship between American Jews and Israelis. We're different people. We have different lives. We are not one. And I worry that all the resources that have gone into Birthright Israel has raised $50 billion since it began, and it's almost all gone to Israel. If that money had gone to American Jewish educational institutions, Tikkun Olam institutions, social justice institutions, or places that think about the future of American Jews and what it means to be an American Jew, I think American Jewry would be in great shape. But just to say these things, as I'm saying them now, is to offend people and to offend many of the powers that be, and is considered oddly anti-Semitic in some ways. So that's the plea I make at the end of the book. But in the meantime, I'm just trying to describe a situation which is rather odd, because the discourse that I've been examining has been transformed enormously, and the politics have kind of remained frozen. And I'm very curious to see where that leads in the future. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. I want to remind everybody in the audience to send in your questions. We have just under half an hour for our Q&A, so please send in your questions. I want to begin, first of all, by picking up on the point you just made about the disconnect between the shifting US discourse, public discourse about Israel and about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the continuities in American policymaking, even today. What do you think accounts for this disconnect? I mean, typically we would imagine, the US being a democracy, that public policy, government policy would follow from public opinion or reflect public opinion. But you've highlighted this disconnect. Why is
I
that?
didn't want to interrupt you, but you said the US being a democracy, and I don't imagine that. I don't imagine it any more than I imagine our policy on gun control to be democratically formed. I think that AIPAC has a lot in common with the NRA. Americans have been broadly supportive of Israel, no question, but they haven't been nearly as supportive as AIPAC has demanded Congress be. And during the 1980s, they demanded that liberal congressmen supported the governments of El Salvador and Guatemala, which were carrying out death squad operations against human rights workers, because those governments, in order to curry favor with the United States, were supporting Israel and the UN. Israel is the only government in the world that gets US military aid, and it gets more military aid per capita than any other country, probably maybe more than I think they could have combined, without having to account for how it's spent. They get the money and they can do whatever they want with it. The distinction among American Jews, I'll take your question a little further. I gave a similar talk to this in Tel Aviv University in May. And a gentleman raised his hand and said, well, I see this shift coming. I don't dispute it. But as a Trump supporting Israeli, why should I care? And I said, you should care for two reasons. One is that if you lose American Jews, as many Israelis are perfectly willing to do, Bibi Netanyahu has said so, and so have many others, because you have evangelical Christians, you really are all alone in the world. And it's scary to be all alone in the world. I mean, the Christians are supporting Israel for their own reasons, not because they care about Israel. It's because they have this theological belief. And they also like the fact that Israelis beat the crap out of Muslims, who they hate a lot more than even the anti-Semites hate more than they hate Jews. But the second reason, which is I think speaks more directly to your point, is that the only place you find a great deal of agitation over Israel and Palestine is on elite American universities. I'm sure you have it at UCLA. I have it at Brooklyn College. That's because it's New York. It's not elite university, but it's in New York. So these students are being taught about a very different Israel than, Dov, I imagine you and I were taught about. Certainly my friend Tony Blinken was taught about a very different Israel. And in the future, they are going to be peopling congressional staffs, State Department, national security staff, the think tanks, and looking at Israel in a very different way. So the change is coming very slowly. But the short answer to your question is America is not a democracy. It's somewhat democratic in certain ways. We have elections every 4 years. It seems like the winner usually wins, although not always. But that's about it. Policy itself is not determined democratically. It's determined by power and money. And whereas AIPAC and its allies have been challenged in recent years, particularly by J Street, which is growing. And I would say J Street probably represents slightly more than half of the views of American Jews. The groups that have the power are not responsible to American Jews. As I said, AIPAC supported 109 insurrectionists, including one guy who supports the replacement theory, which is explicitly anti-Semitic. They weren't going to support Lynn Cheney until people pointed out, hey, what's the matter? You're not supporting Lynn Cheney. So these groups are responsible only to their funders, and they're very powerful. I wrote a book many years ago on democracy and foreign policy called "Who Speaks for America," and the way foreign policy is made in this country is anything but democratic. We are broadly democratic in our elections, very broadly, very incompletely. But when it comes to policy making, the impeti for what to do are very different. And I would make one point about AIPAC that's very important. I forget who I quote, but it's the right person to quote on this kind of topic, who says the real power of AIPAC is in what never happens. Because if you fight AIPAC in Congress, you've got a lot of problems. if you become known as a congressional staffer who's not favorably viewed by AIPAC, you'll have professional problems in your life. You may not get another job. If you keep your mouth shut, you won't have those problems. So there's very little incentive to oppose AIPAC. And so a lot of things never happen simply because it would be a bad idea to take them up. And that's their real strength. And that's what will change very gradually.
So I want to pick up on this point, and because it seems that in terms of the role that the pro-Israel lobby, AIPAC, and others play, you make the argument that they're an important part of explaining American support for Israel, and particularly the lack of a change in US policy toward Israel. Whereas one of our previous speakers, Walter Russell Mead, really, dismisses the role of the pro-Israel lobby, calls that kind of the Balkan theory, referring to Mearsheimer and Walt's argument about the role of the pro-Israel lobby. I wanted to, is that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you had some differences with our previous authors. Is that one of the key differences, is the role of the pro-Israel lobby? Are there others? I'm curious if you could.
Okay, well, sure, let's get into that. I haven't said anything about Walter's book previously. I've known Walter for 40 years. I was a fellow. One of my very first jobs in my life was a fellow at the World Policy Institute. And I read Walter's first book, which I believe is called Mortal Splendor. And I said, we got to hire this guy. And we did. And actually, Walter was so brilliant that he ended up replacing me. That was back when he was a liberal. Now he's a conservative. And one of the only conservatives I read with pleasure and with profit. He's a great writer, brilliant man. Couldn't be more wrong about Israel. I read that whole book. I was amazed. It had very little to do, I thought, with America and Israel. It was brilliant on how to Christians view the Holy Land, and how does that fit in with their theology. And Walter's very sympathetic to evangelical conservative Christians. But how does U.S. policy actually get made? The book has almost no politics in it. And you're right. You use the right word. He dismisses the role of the quote unquote pro-Israels. He doesn't deal with it. He dismisses it outright. He almost says it's anti-Semitic even to consider it. There was a review in the New York Times, of all places, that said, well, he grants the existence of the Israel lobby. It's like granting the existence, I said, of the National Rifle Association or the AIRP. It's the most powerful lobby in the history of the foreign policy lobby in the history of the United States. He doesn't deal with the role of the media at all. And policing the media, I haven't nearly done justice. An awful lot of the book is about that, because that's really what I know how to do best, is explain how the media works. He doesn't really even deal very much with Jews, with the world of Jewish life. So Walter is a scholar of the ideals of foreign policy, and you can learn an awful lot about the relationship of American ideals to the rhetoric of American foreign policy, about how actually the sausage gets made. Sausage is not the best metaphor for U.S.-Israeli policy. It's not kosher, but there's the book. I kept waiting for it to happen, and it never happened. It's a long book. It's not there. So I was actually very confused. It's like 800 pages. I was very confused by the time I finished it, because it never really got to the issue. I do think, and I'm saying, I don't think this was Walter's intent. I think Walter is entirely honest, and he's a serious intellectual. But I do think that the book is very comforting to right-wing Jews who take it, who hold it up and say, look, you're right. This expert, this 800-page book says it's not AIPAC. It's not the lobby. It's that Americans love us, particularly Christians love us. And so that's very comforting. And I think that accounts for its embrace by right-wing organizations. I saw that this extreme right-wing website, Allgemeiner, named Walter its fourth favorite American. I don't know exactly what the list, but he tweeted this. He's number 4 on some list of people that this extreme right-wing organization with regard to Israel really loves. And personally, I don't see how you can do justice to this issue and end up in a place like that, because like I said, it's very complicated. I don't think my book will be embraced by anyone, to tell you the truth, because whereas I am much more critical of Israel and is quote unquote pro-Israel organizations than most people are in the mainstream media, I'm also quite critical of Palestinians, and I don't take a side. I'm awfully critical of the BDS movement. I'm sort of for a while I was one of the sort of leading critics of it in public. I helped form an organization of academics that was trying to create space on campus that said, we don't support BDS. We support their right to speak. So we don't support shutting them down like so many Jewish organizations do. But we don't support them even though we support the right to criticize Israel and we're for open debate. That's a very lonely space. And the organization had a lot of trouble getting off the ground.
So I want to ask you about the role of the media, because you write a lot about the role of the media. You know it inside and out. You've been involved in The Nation for many years as a contributor. And you mentioned in your talk, and it was something that Walter Russell Mead also mentioned, that The Nation was a staunch supporter of Zionism, of Israel before.
The Nation funneled money. The Nation Institute funneled illegal money to Israel from American funders, so it wouldn't appear on the tax records of the people giving it. It's just so funny. I was having drinks. Give me 1 second, because it's a cute story. I was having drinks with my editor at The Nation, Katrina Vandenhoevel, and a woman says, "Are you Eric Alterman?" And I said, "Yeah." She goes, "I was your real estate agent 20 years ago or 15 years ago." And I said, "Really?" She goes, "Yeah." She goes, and then she wrote me and said, "My mom, her aunt, not her mom, her aunt was the head of the Nation Institute in the 1940s. And I have her papers, and do you want them?" And I said, "Sure." So she sent me the papers, and I discovered that the Nation Institute had been funneling this illegal money to Israel. So that's how deeply involved it was. And of course, one of my mentors in life was I.F. Stone, who I wrote about in my thesis back in 1982, and I became good friends with. And he covered Israel for The Nation and traveled with the refugees and wrote a wonderful book called Underground to Palestine, and was deeply sympathetic to the Israelis, although he was also part of the Hood movement. Anyway, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so I want to ask about both of these aspects. First of all, in terms of the media in general, and then I want to talk more about the left.
Yeah.
But in terms of the media, I mean, there has been this profound change in terms of how the media covers not only Israel, but also the conflict. What explains that, do you think, in terms of the media coverage in particular? I mean, you note in the book the rise of Palestinian voices, for example, Palestinian narrative. Is that the shift? Is that there's more attention to Palestinian voices as opposed to covering mostly Jewish opinion? Why do you think the media, and take The Nation as an example, has shifted so profoundly in its treatment?
I don't think you could take The Nation as an example of anything in the media. I could have called this book "It's Complicated." There was a long essay published. Part of it was published in the Columbia Journalism Review, but the longer version was published by the Kennedy School, their media arm, about the relationship of the New York Times to Israel, and what accounted for the New York Times shift, which, when this piece was written, was not nearly as has gone even further since then. The New York Times coverage of the war in Gaza led Abe Foxman to cancel his 60-year subscription to the New York Times, and called it anti-Semitic, etc., because it printed pictures of the 69 children that were killed in Gaza. He said that was anti-Semitic. Anyway, a lot of things have happened. Number one, Israel was definitely the white hats versus the black hats. On the left, I mean, I hope I don't confuse people. In the mainstream media, it was white hats and black hats. On the left, it was anti-imperialist versus imperialist. So when Israel was kicking out the British, it was anti-imperialist, and the Arabs were seen as the backward handmaidens of the British back in those days. This changed in '67 on the left, but it went in the opposite direction in the mainstream media. So Israel, this heroic Israeli narrative, this Exodus narrative, was very, very strong in the mainstream media. Now, I try to deal with the issue of Jews in the media without, I mean, I'm obviously not an anti-Semite, and it's and merely to bring it up often brings accusations of anti-Semitism. But there was definitely and still is an identification on the part of many American Jews who are, according to the editor of the Jewish Forward, quoted in this book, radically overrepresented in the media. So you want to call someone an anti-Semite, call the editor of the Forward an anti-Semite. And that was very strong. And again, it's still very strong. And Israel purposely exploited this. But even that, as with American Jews, generally has begun to change, in part because of changes in Israel, and in part because of growing sympathy for the Palestinians, and everything I describe in this book. So I have quotes in the book from the editor of the New York Times, the editor of the Wall Street Journal editorial page, and the editor of the Washington Post, all saying, whatever's okay with Israel is okay with me. That was in the 1970s and early 1980s. Today, unless you work for Rupert Murdoch, there's much more of an attempt to be, quote, to be even-handed to both sides of the issue. Now, I'm actually critical of the both sides of any issue, because this issue is multifaceted. But the things I described, where Israel became increasingly a cause for conservatives, and whereas the media are not conservative or liberal, they're much more interested in proving that they're not liberal. So, because most of the attacks come from conservatives. So they bend over backwards to be whatever they're accused of not being. And depending where they are, the pressure, it works. One thing I found very, very interesting, which I take up at the end of the book, is the argument over the word apartheid. It's actually a great metaphor for the whole thing. It'll take me a couple minutes to explain, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So look, when the word apartheid in the context of this debate is very problematic, because everyone thinks of South Africa and thinks you're saying Israel is ipso facto racist. But that's not what the word means anymore. The word now refers to the International Criminal Court's definition. And when you and a number of human rights groups, most recently Amnesty International, said it definitely applies to Israel. Now, it's an arguable position, and I wish Amnesty International, although they did a very good job of research, their report is filled with incendiary rhetoric, which made it an easy target for people who wanted to discredit it. But if you take the example of the West Bank, there's no question, there's simply no argument that you're treated differently if you're a Jewish settler than if you're an Arab, occupied Arab there. That is apartheid. Now, you can say, well, it's temporary, it's not part of Israel, and therefore Israel is not guilty of apartheid. You can say that, except that the people who accuse people of being anti-Semitic for using apartheid are the very same people who say it is part of Israel, and that there should be no distinction between the two. And in fact, the Biden administration, I just read today that Tony Blinken is trying to prevent these distinctions being made in U.S. labeling of whether or not a product comes from the West Bank or from inside the Green Line. Now, Ben & Jerry's ice cream, I was in Israel in May and June. You can buy Ben & Jerry's ice cream anywhere in Israel. When they said we don't want to sell it in the occupied territories, which, by the way, are rarely called occupied territories anymore in Israel or by pro-Israel, quote unquote, pro-Israel organizations, they were taking the position that's held by something very close to a majority of American Jews, that the West Bank is not Israel, that Israel should, it would be okay for Israel to receive some pressure from the United States to work harder to make peace with the Palestinians, as difficult as that looks today. And they said, we love Israel, we're liberal Zionists. And yet this position was attacked by the very people who accused them of embracing the idea of apartheid. And there was an enormous fight over the term, when Amnesty International issued its report, and the New York Times, this is what I found so funny, they just threw up its hands and couldn't deal with it. It took them, and I was like writing them all the time saying, what's going on? Because I was writing about it and I was closing my book. It took them 55 days to acknowledge the fact of the report itself or the fight over the report. Because the fact is that if the occupation is permanent, and it sure looks like it is, then Israel is definitely guilty of apartheid. You can argue it's more complicated inside the Green Line, but in occupied territories, the people are treated differently because of who they are and how they're born. And yet typically the discussion is shut down by accusations that are personal in nature and don't deal with the complications of the issue. Now, I expect with some groups that will happen to me. It certainly happened to Barack Obama, to Jimmy Carter, to Tony Judd. It even happened to Steven Spielberg. So I'd be in good company in that regard. But this is, again, one reason I felt compelled to write a 512-page book, because the reality of the complicated reality of these issues rarely gets aired, because the media is only an inch deep, and it's just this guy says this person responds this, and that's the end of it.
So we only have a few minutes, and this is going to be another big question for you, but I feel like it has to be asked. Because you spent, we talked about the media, and you talked about the shift of left-wing and liberal opinion, progressive opinion regarding Israel, from a very pro-Israeli and Zionist position to one that is increasingly critical of Israel, pro-Palestinian, even critical of Zionism itself. One thing that remains constant despite this great shift is the preoccupation with Israel. The role that Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict plays in the imagination of the American left. Why do you think that is? I mean, we often hear this is kind of anti-Semitism, or the new anti-Semitism. And I'm assuming that you don't buy into that argument. So why do you think Israel and this conflict has always been such a major preoccupation for whether it's left-wing publications or thinkers, and in generally in left-wing discourse?
Well, I could run over to the side of the room and get the book. I deal with this in the very first pages of the book, which is that Jews and the nation Israel have always been a preoccupation of the world, of any place Jews have lived. It's very interesting. I have on the shelves up here David Nierenberg's wonderful history of anti-Semitism, and that's what I relied on, really, more than anything, for the role that Jews have played in the imagination of Christianity, of Christendom, actually is a better term. And it's fascinating, and there are good and interesting explanations for it. But the reason that people give, like when you say to people, why are you boycotting Israel? Why aren't you boycotting China? Why aren't you boycotting the United States? We took the land from the Native Americans. China is occupying Tibet. Why aren't you boycotting? Why are we so down with Ukraine and not down with the Palestinians? Well, the easy answer to that is we give Israel $3.8 billion a year. We're funding what they're doing. And American Jews augment that with a fantastic amount. So it's on us. And secondly, the argument that's offered is that Israel is a democratic country and therefore open to persuasion in a way that Russia and China are not. But I agree, it requires explanation. Those are not sufficient explanations. The reason is because because the Palestinians, the larger reason is because it has always been thus. But why do young people come on campus and get involved in this particular struggle rather than saving the climate, or I don't know, saving the climate's a good one because it's their future. Inequality is another good one. The answer is because there's a romanticization of oppressed peoples that has always been the case on the left. I was demonstrating on behalf of El Salvador when I was in college. When I was in graduate school at Yale, the first time I went, there was a fantastic movement on behalf of South Africa. It was thrilling. Cornel West was a professor at Yale at the time, and he would get arrested in his three-piece suit, and people would be singing Free Nelson Mandela and dancing, and it was a lot of fun. And you felt righteous, and it gave people a sense of power. I think a lot of college a lot of college activism is in part driven by genuine idealism and looked at this idealistically. Israel has everything and the Palestinians have nothing. So you're on the side of Palestine, but also in the sense of feeling like you're powerful in a way that you're not in any other way of your life, that you have to do what your professors say, you have to do what your parents say, but you can exercise power through discourse. That's one reason I think that political correctness, quote unquote, is so powerful on the left. I don't think it's anything like the problem that the right makes it out to be, or that even the New York Times editorial page makes it out to be. I think onset of fascism is a lot more worrisome, but it is a real thing. I feel it at the Nation. I feel it in Brooklyn College, that the need to police one's words out of respect for the feelings of leftists on campus or concerns is in some measure a result of their ability to exercise power over words. Now, I'm very critical of the left historically for paying, and also the Palestinian movement, for paying more attention to this kind of thing than to actual questions of power. Like, I've been in a refugee camp, a Palestinian refugee camp, once in my life. When I walked in, the Israeli soldiers guarding, I said, "Are you crazy for going in there?" And it was kind of crazy. I almost got killed just when people asked me if I was a Jew. But it's also the worst situation I've ever seen in my life. It was open sewage. There were starving children. They were unclothed, unclean. And those people, I was there a long time ago. Those people have grandchildren in those refugee camps now. Now, what is being done for these people? You know, how are they being helped by the current movement? I don't see that they're being helped at all. I don't see how the people under occupation are being helped at all. I think all this argument over the discourse, over what is said, over who's allowed to speak on campus, does nothing for the people who desperately need help. And that's one of many reasons I wish that the Palestinians had better leadership and better followers. And that's, again, a reason why a lot of people who will enjoy all of the criticism I give of the pro-Israel side of the discourse won't enjoy everything about this book.
Well, I think you've made a very strong case for how the discourse is changing with regards to Israel and Israel-Palestine as a conflict, but also at the same time how this changing discourse has minimal impact on both US policy and the conflict itself. And it's an interesting paradox. I want to thank you for, really highlighting this, because I think it is one of the things that we wrestle with. On the one hand, as academics, we pay a lot of attention to ideas and discourse, and we believe that matters greatly. But at the same time, we see that, at least when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, all of the shifts on the left and in discourse and in American politics aren't actually being translated into any real policy changes or concrete changes on the ground. So I want to thank you, and thank you for sharing your book and joining us today. Thank all the audience. This will be available on our website as well as on our YouTube channel, so please share it widely. Go out and buy Eric's excellent book, and hope you'll join us all again for our future webinars. Thank you all, and goodbye.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.